So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit more about worker strike and abolition. If you haven't, I would tune into the first video, the intro to worker strike and abolition, because although I think like at first look, this might not be like the most intuitive place, especially if you don't have like a lot of diversity or understanding of like what types of criticisms are normally read on the resolution. I definitely think it's something that you should invest time in, and definitely something that's really worth putting in a lot of hard prep for, because I definitely think that if a team is really cunning and smart, there are a lot of really good arguments to be made about the resolution and the relationship that worker strike has to abolition. And so in this resolution, in this video, I definitely want to continue that conversation and talk a little bit more about like what abolition as a criticism looks like on the negative versus policy teams. This is the place where I think this critique will show up often, although I do think it's still good as an affirmative strategy. And so it's the place where I definitely want to start the kind of like lectures that I'm doing on this series. And it's definitely a place where I think that a lot of investment can be really strong because of the ways in which the worker strike and human rights kind of like functioning of the topic work to really set out like some of the core link ground for what abolition will look like. And so in this video, I want to kind of like start the foundation of that, talking a little bit more about like what the kind of like framing and thesis portion of the debate are, and what your priorities should be in terms of like making this argument happen, because I think that those three things are really kind of what will determine your ability to have really persuasive link arguments and alternative framings and the rest of the things that I've kind of talked about a little bit in the intro video and then the last one. And so yeah, hopefully this will be kind of like really helpful as kind of like another introductory idea into like what abolition will start to kind of manifest as on this resolution. So let's just talk a little bit about just like what this thing looks like in terms of like how you should be building it. I think that a really strong abolition argument for this resolution really needs to hold the line on how worker strike is defined. I feel like most teams will really try to say that because prisoners are kind of like in wage labor in their own way, and even if it's not consenting, that the idea of a worker strike also applies to prisoners. And I definitely think that you need to make a bunch of arguments about why human rights frameworks make that impossible to happen, why human rights are something that can be given but also taken away. And there are a lot of ways in which human rights as a framework basically attempts to dissuade us from thinking about how those that are kind of like blocked out of access to human rights are necessarily excluded from that framing and are what human rights are really protected from. And I think that being able to establish that as a place where you're kind of like holding the bright line for why their establishment of worker strike doesn't include prisoners, then you have a really good argument for like why that kind of exclusion creates forms of violence and basically necessitates the failure of our worker strike movement, because of the way it doesn't go broadly enough to stop like the core violence of capitalism, which is like what stems from carcerality and is created in the midst of carcerality. And I think that really situating a lot of your offense there could be super helpful. I think the other thing that's really important for this type of this is the way that also I think that a lot of the arguments should kind of be framed as you're starting to think about like how you're able to make the alternative more competitive, which I also think is a really important part of making this criticism work. I think that oftentimes a lot of K teams, especially as of late, have really kind of like moved away from like being able to like really win or really going all in on like alternative solvency and alternatives closer to like picks and counter plans. But I think that this is a criticism where you can get really funky with the alternatives, and hopefully later on when we get to that explanation, you can kind of see the different ways in which building like substantial warranted examples and things like that can really win you a lot of key debates, especially against some of these kind of like softer leftist affirmatives that will show up on the worker strike resolution. I think that when we kind of like think about what some of this is kind of going to look like when we start trying to create more specific advice in the context of framing, a lot of the stuff that you really want to do in terms of your framing debate here is really start to create that kind of core tie between like why thinking about carcerality is so important to like how we think about the worker strike. I think that your arguments could really base especially and change depending on like what you're trying to read versus like a more like IR kind of like hard right affirmative versus like a more soft left affirmative. I think affirmatives that are really investing in the worker strike as this kind of like pedagogical and theoretical thing, I think that the best way to kind of like create a lot of the arguments that you really want to make is by making a framing argument that is about why carcerality in the prison is at the locus of the continued like inequality or violence at the kind of like center of the kind of like nexus of capitalism, and why capitalism is only able to continue itself through its reliance on predatory governance and its reliance on the prison system as a kind of like core functioning of how private and public entities are able to tie themselves together and generate profit off of the general dispossession that comes from various anti-black policies, etc. And I think that being able to draw that kind of like core kind of like framing argument for why we need to start our analysis there gives a lot more credence to why some of your central link arguments really bear things on the ability for the affirmative to resolve capitalism, to be able to create a condition that's better and palatable for creating resistance outside of the confines of the workers' strike. And I think that that's like incredibly important. I think that the other thing that could be like well used against a lot of other affirmatives that are kind of closer to the hard or right side that aren't really concerned with the resolving capitalism portions of what this affirmative could do. I think that reading things like Abolition, Democracy as framing arguments for how the kind of like idea of modeling after the U.S. is already a flawed system and requires an investment in a model of democracy that like requires the blocking out of the lumpen proletariat, and using abolition democracy as a differential way of analyzing and be able to like come to terms with like how we should be thinking about our relationship to the state and the tactics that we produce in relationship to like what kind of policies are passed, etc., and being able to use that as a lens of evaluation that you give the judges as why they should be able to value your alternative and why they should also be able to value the type of link arguments you're using as a reason to refute or say no to the plan, just because of the way in which the plan kind of invests in various forms of violence. I think that the other place where I kind of really want to be able to spend time on this video is the thesis portion of the debate, which I think is really important because I feel like the thesis kind of like arguments that you will make with a lot of the abolition stuff are really about why the core ties between like the prison system and its centrality and the affirmatives kind of theorizing, whether it's at the IR scale or at the scale of trying to like theorize how we get rid of capitalism. And I think that being able to win that kind of like intertwining between the carceral system and both of those things straight out the gate is really important, A, for the continuance of the kind of like framework stuff that we're talking about above, but B, I think that the hardest thing for judges to get over is like, why isn't the abolition case just kind of this big link of omission? And I think the best way for you to fight back by that understanding is by continually kind of like reiterating the reason in which like the prison is kind of tied up with all of these values, why it's not possible to think about a world where workers are paid fair or working conditions are better when the prison is still possible and people can continue to like make profits back via the prison. It makes it harder for private entities to budget, makes it harder for us to make the government more accountable, etc. All of which is kind of like core reasons of why the kind of like functioning of thinking about the workers' strike is completely separate from what's happening with the carceral system as fundamentally violent, and an investment in the continuation of such a system I think would be really helpful in terms of building like really good offensive arguments that like create strong kind of like parallels between your stuff and the affirmative stuff, which I think is just really helpful for how you can kind of like make offensive arguments that will frame the rest of the flow that we'll talk about in the next video. So hopefully this video is helpful, and hopefully you'll come back for more. Thanks.